Exploring America's forgotten shanty towns of the 1930s. America in the 1930s, a nation once booming with prosperity, was now drowning in despair. The Great Depression had left millions jobless, homeless, and hopeless. The stock market crashed and banks collapsed. Shanty towns began to rise across the country. These towns were mockingly called Hoovervilles after the sitting president of the time, Herbert Hoover. They were makeshift settlements built from scraps and desperation, and they quickly became the symbols of America's darkest economic crisis. Today, we take a journey into the forgotten world of these American Hoovervilles and what life was like in them for the average folk. Historical context. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of everyday life in the Hoovervilles, let's take a look at some historical context to understand what led to such dire conditions. The Great Depression was a time of unimaginable hardship. After the stock market crash of 1929, businesses failed, banks closed their doors, and families lost everything. By 1932, the unemployment rate had climbed to a staggering 25%. An estimated 15 million Americans were without work, and many of them were evicted from their homes with nowhere to go. Out of this economic devastation emerged the Hoovervilles, sprawling makeshift settlements that became home to the country's most vulnerable. These shanty towns became a testament to both despair and resilience of the common people. They were carved out of depression and a will to survive against the odds. What were Hoovervilles like? The settlements sprung up in nearly every major city in America and across a variety of areas. Hoovervilles were set up in every place from vacant parking lots to riverbanks. These places were transformed into vast and huge encampments for the people no longer able to rent a proper home. The residents of these makeshift towns were very diverse too. They came from all walks of life. Some of them were unemployed factory workers, some were laid-off tradesmen, and then there were farmers too, who were ruined by the Great Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Many families were torn apart by financial ruin, and people were forced to settle in different Hoovervilles often. And, interestingly, unlike the later America, these towns were not racially segregated. Black, white, and immigrant families found themselves united in their struggle to endure the situation they all found themselves in. What was it like to live there? Living in a Hooverville was no easy task. It was a daily struggle against hunger, the weather, and disease. The shelters were often as crude as the circumstances which had forced people into them. They were built using whatever scraps could be found, including cardboard, wooden planks, tin sheets, and even old crates. Some families lived in shacks so small they barely had the space to sleep. Others dug holes in the ground and covered them up with whatever they could find, sometimes just a sheet of metal or an old tarp to shield themselves from the wind and rain. And of course, without plumbing, residents had no running water or proper sanitation. Many Hoovervilles were built near rivers, not just for access to water, but also because there was nowhere else to go. But the water was easily contaminated, leading to outbreaks of disease. There were no toilets, only makeshift latrines, which made the unsanitary conditions worse. Trash piled up, which attracted rats and insects. In the winter, people huddled together for warmth, burning whatever they could find: wood, coal, even old tires, just to keep from freezing. Summers were just as harsh, with no escape from the heat and little access to clean drinking water. The people living in Hoovervilles often wore whatever clothing they had before they lost their homes, but as time passed, their clothes became tattered and dirty. Men dressed in patched-up suits, which were remnants of the jobs they once had, with holes in the knees and frayed cuffs. Women wore faded dresses that had been mended so many times the fabric was barely holding together. Children ran barefoot through the dirt, with their clothes being oversized hand-me-downs that had been passed down from sibling to sibling. For warmth in the winter, people layered whatever they had: old coats, scarves made from scraps of fabric, even newspapers stuffed into clothing to insulate against the cold. Shoes were a luxury. Many people wore the same pair until they fell apart, and some often went barefoot in freezing temperatures. Food was scarce and every meal was a struggle. Without money, people relied on charity and scavenging to feed themselves. Bread lines and soup kitchens run by churches and charitable organizations were lifelines for many. Hoover's stew became popular during this time, which was basically just a soup made from any vegetables that could be found: potatoes, onions, or cabbage. It was often very thin, and if you were lucky, you could add some pieces of meat. Some other foods, like dandelion salad and water pie, show us how people relied on scavenging whatever ingredients they could find to feed their families. Some people even caught small animals like squirrels or pigeons to eat, while others relied on growing small gardens, planting beans, potatoes, or whatever could survive in poor soil. People also began bartering with neighbors, exchanging what little they had. One family might trade a loaf of stale bread for a handful of dried beans, while another might swap an old coat for a few potatoes. The black market thrived in Hoovervilles, with people selling homemade goods, stolen items, or even services like repairing shoes or cutting hair just to get by. One personal story from that time is of Jessica Spencer. Jessica was born in Torrey, Utah in 1920 and grew up on a remote ranch during the Great Depression. Her family had no running water or indoor plumbing, and everyone worked hard to grow food and care for livestock. Although money was scarce, they never went hungry. Her father raised cattle and pigs, while her mother managed a large garden and preserved food for the family. Jessica recalled how getting 2 new dresses and a pair of shoes for school was a luxury. After school, she would change into old clothes to help with chores. Washing clothes, especially scrubbing socks on a washboard, was a dreaded Saturday task. Entertainment was also very simple: silent movies at church and family sing-alongs led by her mother, who also played the mandolin. She remembered the government buying cattle during tough times, sometimes shooting and burying them due to drought and low prices. The hardships of the Depression made her frugal, and she came to believe that younger generations should learn traditional skills that make one independent and self-sufficient. But Jessica's story is that of a relatively easier life, as many people had it much worse. To fully grasp the scale of suffering, consider this. By the peak of the Great Depression, over 15 million Americans were homeless. At least 300 Hoovervilles existed across the country, some housing as many as 5,000 residents. Families who had once enjoyed middle-class stability now found themselves living in cardboard shacks. By 1932, the United States had become a nation of the displaced. A quarter of the population was unemployed, and Hoovervilles became the last refuge for many. These numbers aren't just statistics, they represent real people, real families, real struggles. Some notable Hoovervilles. Among the many Hoovervilles that dotted the nation, a few are still remembered due to their sheer size and organization. One of the most well-documented and largest Hoovervilles was the one in Seattle. It sprawled across 9 acres of public land and housed approximately 1,200 residents. Unlike many others, it had an elected vigilance committee and even an unofficial mayor named Jesse Jackson. This settlement had achieved a very rare form of self-governance, with its own rules to maintain law and order in the place. The committee also pushed for racial unity in an otherwise deeply segregated America. St. Louis was home to an even larger Hooverville, housing as many as 8,000 residents. What made this encampment extraordinary was its level of social organization. Unlike many shanty towns that were left to fend for themselves, St. Louis's Hooverville developed its own institutions. Residents built churches, established rudimentary schools too, and received support from private philanthropists and charities. It became a community in its own right, which was built on the principles of necessity and nurtured by the people's shared sense of suffering. Legacy and impact. By the late 1930s, as the economy slowly recovered under Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal policies, many Hoovervilles naturally began to disappear. Government relief programs, job creation efforts, and public housing initiatives gradually reduced the need for these settlements. However, the legacy of Hoovervilles remains a powerful chapter in American history. They stand as strong reminders of the consequences of economic collapse and governmental inaction. They also highlight the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to endure, adapt, and even find hope in the most desperate conditions. Today, as we examine the past, we must ask ourselves, how can we ensure such suffering is never repeated? What lessons can we learn from those who lived through the Great Depression? And perhaps most importantly, how do we care for the most vulnerable among us in our own time? Thank you for joining us on this journey through America's forgotten shanty towns. If you found this video meaningful, please subscribe for more historical deep dives. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.